Welcome to Chapter 8 on sampling. In this chapter, we'll be looking at sampling method, which is probability and non-probability, and ending with unit of analysis. So what is actually sampling? So for you to actually draw a valid conclusion from your results, you have to carefully decide how you will select a sample that is representative of the group as a whole. Okay, so there are two types of sampling methods. So number one is probability sampling, which it involves random selection, allowing you to make strong statistical inferences about the whole group. Whereas secondly is the non-probability sampling, where it involves non-random selection based on convenience or other criteria, allowing you to easily collect data. So when you conduct research about a group of people, it's rarely possible to collect data from every person in that group. So instead, you select a sample. So the sample is the group of individuals who will actually participate in the research. So first, you need to understand the difference between a population and a sample and identify the target population of your research. So the population is the entire group that you want to draw conclusions about. The sample is a specific group of individuals that you will collect data from. The population can be defined in terms of geographical location, age, income, and many other characteristics. It can be very broad or quite narrow. Maybe you want to make inferences about the whole adult population of your country. Maybe your research focuses on the customers of certain company, patients with specific health condition, or students in a single school. So it is important to carefully define your target population according to the purpose and practicalities of your projects. If the population is very large, demographically mixed, and geographically dispersed, it might be difficult to gain access to a representative sample. Okay, so for example, this is the differences between population and sample. Population is the whole area, and sample is a selection only. Okay, so sampling frame is the actual list of individuals that the sample will be drawn from. Okay, ideally, it should include the entire population and nobody who is not part of the population. Okay, so example sampling frame, you are doing research on working condition at company X. Your population is all 1,000 employees of the company. So your sampling frame is the company's HR database, which lists the names and contact details of every employee. Okay, so the number of individuals you should include in your sample depends on various factors, including the size and variability of the population and your research design. So there are different sample size calculators and formulas depending on what you want to achieve with statistical analysis. Okay, so probability sampling means that every member of the population has a chance of being selected. It is mainly used in quantitative research. So if you want to produce results that are representative of the whole population, probability sampling techniques are the most valid choice. So there are four main types of probability sampling. So we have simple random sample, we have systematic sample, we have stratified sample, and we have a cluster sample. So in a simple random sample, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So your sampling frame should include the whole population. So to conduct this type of sampling, you can use tools like random number generators or other techniques that are based entirely on chance. Okay. Secondly, when we are talking about systematic sample, so systematic sampling is similar to simple random sampling, but it is usually slightly easier to conduct. Every member of the population is listed with a number, but instead of randomly generating numbers, individuals are chosen at regular interval. So for example, 1, 2, so you take number 2. 3, 4. You take number 4. Okay. So it is chosen at regular intervals. And then we have stratified sample. So stratified sample involve dividing the population into subpopulations that may differ in important ways. It allows you to draw more precise conclusions by ensuring that every subgroup is properly represented in the sample. To use this sampling method, you will be dividing the population into subgroups, or we call strata, okay, based on the relevant characteristic, gender, age range, income bracket, job role, etc. Right? And the last type of probability sampling is cluster sample. So cluster sampling also involve dividing the populations into subgroups, but each subgroup have a different or similar characteristic to the whole sample. Okay, so instead of sampling individuals from each subgroup, you randomly select the whole entire subgroup. Okay, now we are going to talk about non-probability sampling methods. So in a non-probability sample, individuals are selected based on a non-random criteria, and not every individual has a chance of being included. So this type of sample is easier and cheaper to access, but it has a higher risk of sampling bias. So that means that in the interference you can make about the population are weaker than with probability sample, and your conclusions may be more limited. If you use a non-probability sample, you should still aim to make it as representative of the population as possible. All right. And non-probability sampling techniques are often used in exploratory and qualitative research. So in this type of research, the aim is not to test a hypothesis about the broad population, but to develop an initial understanding of a small or under-researched populations. Okay, so these are the example of non-probability sampling. So we have a convenience sampling, we have a purposive sample, snowball sample, and quota sample. Okay, so in convenience sampling, all right, it simply includes an individual who happen to be most accessible to the researcher, whoever nearby to you. So this is an easy and inexpensive way to gather initial data, but there is no way to tell if the sample is representative of the population. So it cannot produce generalizable results. Okay. Secondly, when we talk about voluntary response sampling, similar to a convenience sample, a voluntary response sample is mainly based on ease of access. So instead of the researcher choosing participants and directly contacting them, people volunteer themselves. Okay, for example, by responding to a public online survey. So voluntary response samples are always at least somewhat biased, as some people will inherently more likely to volunteer compared to the other person. Thirdly, when we talk about purposive sampling, so this type of sampling, also known as judgment sampling, involve the researcher using their expertise to select a sample that is most useful to the purpose of the research. So it is often used in qualitative research, where the researcher wants to gain detailed knowledge about a specific phenomenon rather than make a statistical inferences, or where the population is very small and specific. So an effective purposive sample must have clear criteria and rationale for inclusion. Okay, and lastly, the snowball sampling. If the population is hard to access, snowball sampling can be used to recruit participants via other participants. The number of people you have access to snowballs are the one that you get in contact with more people. Okay, so let's recap again what is sampling. A sample is a subset of individuals from a larger population. So sampling means selecting the group that you will actually collect data from in your research. For example, if you are researching the opinions of students in your university, you could survey a sample of 100 students. Okay, so in statistics, sampling allows you to test a hypothesis about the characteristic of a population. Okay, so why again are samples used in research? Samples are used to make inferences about populations. Samples are easier to collect data. data from because they are practical, cost-effective, convenient, and manageable, right? And again, what is probability sampling? Probability sampling means that every member of the target population has a known chance of being included in the sample. So probability sampling methods include simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, and also cluster sampling. And lastly, what is non-probability sampling? In non-probability sampling, the sample is selected based on a non-random criteria, and not every member of the population has a chance of being included. So common non-probability sampling methods include convenience sampling, voluntary response sampling, a purposes sampling, snowball sampling, and also a quota sampling. Okay, and we also have a multi-stage sampling, and in multi-stage sampling or multi-stage cluster sampling, you draw a sample from a population using smaller and smaller groups at each stage. So this method is often used to collect data from a large geographical spread group of people in national surveys, for example. So you take the advantage of hierarchical groupings, for example, from state to city to neighborhood. Okay, to create the samples that are less expensive and also time consuming to collect data from. Okay, and we also have sampling bias. So what is sampling bias? It occurs when some members of a population are systematically more likely to be selected in a sample compared to others. Okay, and now next part of this chapter is we are going to talk about unit of analysis, where we have three different units. We have individuals, we have groups, or an organization. Okay, so please read carefully this slide. The notes will be provided in the next page for you to actually understand these three types of unit of analysis. Okay, that's all for today's chapter. Thank you very much. See you in the next chapter.